Turned by Michelle Fox. Digitally narrated using the voice of Kelley Mitchell. Chapter 1. The vampires arrived at midnight, and none of them signed the guest book. Fuckers. The funeral home had charged me $50 for it too. I stood in the back of the room where the memorial service would take place, watching and waiting, miserable and missing my dad, seething and simmering with the need to drive a stake into an unbeating heart. Sunglasses covered my eyes, and a dozen wooden stakes hid inside my suit jacket, making the fabric heavy on my shoulders. The vampires all looked at me when they came in. Their heads turned, sharp and alert, as they homed in on my presence. They could probably hear my heartbeat from across the room. I suppressed a shiver and gestured toward the refreshments. I didn't smile. I wasn't their friend. Dad was dead because of them, and I was going to do my damnedest to make them pay for it. On a table, wine glasses with thin, elegant stems glittered, but the donor blood inside cast a thick shadow. The glassware was a rental from the funeral home. They supplied the blood too. I didn't ask where they'd found it. The line between willing donor and unwilling victim was often blurry. Some blood dealers called it consent if people didn't complain after they'd been held down and forcibly relieved of a pint. The last of them filed in, crowding around the table to pick up a glass of blood and murmuring to each other in hushed voices. There were more than I'd expected. At least 20. The men wore dark suits, and the women favored black sheath dresses with extra high heels. I stared at them, wondering which one had killed my father. The chaplain, a bald, squat vampire the funeral home had hired for the service, waited until everyone had found a seat before clearing his throat. I'd been assured he would say all the right things to the vampires. We are gathered together, brethren of the night, to honor the final death of Dale Simon Russell. He was immortal for but a short time, yet many of you came to know him, and he extended a hand toward where I remained standing in the back, his lovely daughter Dawn. Did someone snicker? My fingers itched to grab one of the stakes in my jacket and pound it into the nearest vamp. So my name was Dawn. Yes, it was ironic. They'd been alive for how many centuries, and hadn't heard that one before. Behind my sunglasses, I rolled my eyes. The chaplain rushed to cover the awkward moment, quoting some meaningless scripture. Then a new disturbance at the entrance of the room stole everyone's attention from him. Someone was late and striding in like he owned the place. He looked the part of King of the Hill too, tall and broad, and wearing a trim black suit, complete with a gray paisley handkerchief in the pocket. Black hair swirled artfully around his head, accenting his dark eyes and high cheekbones on its way down to dust the tops of his shoulders. Like the other vamps, his attention made a beeline for me. He whipped his head around, searching, and then gave me a contemplative once-over, his gaze probing hard enough that I felt it despite my sunglasses. Was it my heartbeat, or did I smell? I swore he'd taken a little sniff as if trying to catch a scent. Maybe vamps had noses like bloodhounds. In which case, I wondered what he thought of my perfume. With a polite nod to me, he settled into a chair on the end of the first row. Waving a hand at the chaplain, he said in a rich tenor, "Excuse my tardiness. Please continue." The bald chaplain cleared his throat again, and then continued with his remembrance of my father. I'd given him Dad's bio, the one I used for the obituary, but he wasn't using any of that. Instead, he was going on and on about the strip club. When Dad turned, he'd entered their world, one that mixed sex, blood and business like it was a religion. With no one willing to hire him at a legit job, Dad had been stuck working as a bouncer, watching the girls and keeping them alive to be bled another day. He'd wanted to keep me out of it all, but it was too late for that now. Just when I was about to tell the chaplain to find another topic, he raised his glass in a toast. That part went pretty well. The words were less salacious and more respectful at least. "To Dale," he said, his voice rich and sonorous. Everyone lifted their glasses in unison. I carefully studied them from behind, looking for clues. Dad had been working at the club when someone had stabbed him through the heart. And poof, just like that, I'd lost the last of my family. Cancer took my mom 2 years earlier. Now it was just me, and soon, even I would be gone. May he live on in our memories and in his daughter's blood. The vamps clinked glasses and murmured, "To Dale," to each other. They downed the blood, and then made to leave. The memorial service was over. Shit. Things weren't going the way I'd planned. I hustled to the door, blocking it with my body. I couldn't let them go. I hadn't found what I was looking for. Dad's killer. The bastard had to be here somewhere. That's what killers did, right? Inserted themselves into the crime somehow. This was the whole reason I'd even had the memorial service in the first place. I didn't want grief. I wanted justice delivered with a stake to the heart. An eye for an eye. A stake for a stake. A death for a death. The late arrival was the first one to challenge me. The cleft in his chin tightened with displeasure. "Miss Russell, may I pass?" "Oh yes." I gave him a wide, fake smile. I just wanted to thank everyone personally for coming. I held out my hand and he took it. "You would be Malachi Jameson." He gave my hand a squeeze, and I was surprised to find his skin somewhat warm. My father had been cold and clammy, like he'd been standing in front of an open fridge too long. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." "And you knew my father how?" He tried to withdraw his hand, but I held on. His midnight eyes examined me, and a little frisson of electricity went through me at the intensity of his gaze. We were acquaintances. That tells me absolutely nothing. Did you work at the strip club together? Did you see my father the night he died? Aren't those questions for the police? He pried his hand out of mine and attempted a friendly smile, but all I could see were the tips of his viperish fangs. The police don't investigate vampire deaths. The deal was, they stayed out of vamp business, so long as the vamps didn't make a mess. At least that was how the detective explained it to me. "And you do?" His voice deepened, challenging me. I pulled myself up to my full height and lifted my chin. "When it comes to my dad, I do. If I don't hunt down his killer, who will?" I glared at all of them hard enough to melt the lenses of my sunglasses. Malachi leaned down to my ear, filling my senses with the smell of his rather nice aftershave and the foreboding weight of his looming presence. "Miss Russell, may I suggest you let this go for your own safety? Vampires don't like it when humans stick their noses where they don't belong. Well, I don't like it when they murder members of my family not once but twice." My voice came out high and shrill, causing the line of vampires behind Malachi Jameson to ripple with uneasiness. "Now if you will please sign the guest book, I would be grateful." With a list of names, I could track them all down one by one and figure out who might have been the killer. Or maybe I would get lucky, and the killer would reveal himself then and there. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I had to try. I couldn't let my dad go without a fight. Malachi didn't move. He stayed right where he was, poised over the throbbing pulse at my throat, his lips right on top of my ear, almost touching, and so close, the hair on the nape of my neck stood on end. I would not suggest accusing us of murder. Someone might mistake your grief for an insult. Your immortality saves no one from death, does it? It just delays the inevitable. I lifted my chin and squared off across from him, feet planted wide, one hand on my hip, the other inside my jacket, fingers curling around a stake. Someone is killing vampires and I happen to care who. They might even be in this room right now. I stared at each of them in turn, but being vampires, not one looked away. They were like cats who'd spotted their prey, silent, still, and totally focused on me. "I care too, Miss Russell." Malachi moved to stand between me and the other vampires, effectively ending the stare down. "More than you can know. Perhaps we can discuss this further at another time." He finally stepped back, giving me some space, and I tried not to gulp air like a dying fish. It wouldn't do to look weak in front of so many predators. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a business card. Would tomorrow night be acceptable? I blinked at the card. No one used them anymore. Everyone had phones, but vampires didn't always keep up. Miss Russell. He arched a brow at me, eyes glittering like obsidian in starlight. That sounds good. I guess. I bit my lip, thinking hard about how to jump a few moves ahead and make him the one who was off balance. He was clearly managing me, but I didn't know how to gain the upper hand. I'd never gone for the jugular, let alone tried to take on vampires. He pressed a business card into my limp hand. Call me around 8 and we'll arrange the details. The stiff edges of the card bit into my palm. Oh, okay. And you needn't worry about detaining anyone else. He nodded back toward the line of fidgeting vampires behind him, all anxious to leave and get on with their night. Don't tell me what to do. I made a fist, crushing his card in my hand despite the sharp edges, not caring if I drew blood. He frowned at me. Miss Russell, you must understand one thing about your father's memorial service. Now I was the one arching a brow. Such as, his killer isn't here. I gaped at him. How do you know that? Because I know who killed him, and like you, I would very much like to see him pay for his crime. He took me by the elbow and guided me away from the door, toward the back of the room. The rest of the vampires wasted no time in leaving, moving silent as ghosts. Sign the guest book, I shouted, struggling to break free of Malachi Jameson's grip. I want your names. No one listened to me, and soon, it was just me and Malachi Jameson, alone in a funeral home. Chapter 2. How long? He asked me, his voice deep as an abyss that could swallow you whole and leave no trace you'd ever existed. How long what? I pulled against his grip, fighting to get his hands off me. He shook me, his grip unbreakable. Tell me, child. How long do you have? I went still and looked at him, carefully studying every detail, searching for some nuance of body language that would explain how he'd figured it out. How did you know? He let me go and tapped the side of his nose. I can smell it. Everyone could. I shrugged, defeated. It's anyone's guess. We'd hoped I would last long enough for Dad. I trailed off and gestured to my neck. But then someone killed him. On the edge of losing it, I shoved my fingers under my sunglasses and pressed against my eyelids, forcing the tears back. I'm sorry, Miss Russell. Deeply sorry. He laid a hand on my shoulder, this time wanting to comfort instead of control. I shrugged him off. What do you care? You were just an acquaintance, right? Correct. But I was once a father myself. A muscle in his jaw twitched. And while I did not know him well, during our brief acquaintance, I could see the love your father had for you. I blinked away tears as the sting of my loss hit me again. I ducked my head and let my hair hide my grief. You said you knew who killed him. Yes. His name is Larry Walker. Why? I lifted my head and regarded him through my sunglasses. Because fear and hate take their payment in death. His voice was grim. Your father was attacked because he'd been turned and for no other reason than that. His words sucked the air right out of my lungs, and I staggered as my knees went weak. My dad had died for no reason. I couldn't process it. He rushed to steady me and guided me to a nearby chair. Lean forward, put your head between your knees and breathe. I know what to do. I pushed him away. My chest heaved as I fought to suck in air, and the world gathered even darker shadows than the sunglasses cast. Everything dimmed and seemed far, far away. I felt like a balloon that someone had let fly free, the ground fading until it looked like nothing more than an anthill. "Breathe, Miss Russell," came a distant, faded voice. But it was too late. I was gone. I woke in a room full of shadows and vampires. Someone had set me on a chaise lounge covered in burgundy velvet. Small brass sconces cast a feeble light. I couldn't tell if I was still at the funeral home or not. Nor was I certain I was safe. The vamps weren't really paying much attention to me, though. They were busy staring at the man tied to a chair in the middle of the room. They looked hungry too, but not for me, for him. I found this strange because the guy had a big beer gut and a really large nose with a too-high forehead, topped by a greasy comb-over. Sure, his arms were full of muscle, but he probably tasted like high cholesterol and hair club for men products. With as much as vampires like to mix sex and feeding, I'd always had the impression that looks mattered. Maybe Beer Belly Guy was a type or something. For a second, I considered that perhaps there was something wrong with me. So fixated were the vamps on the bald, aging guy bound in the chair. I wasn't a supermodel or anything, but I had a decent body and caramel highlights in my brown hair. My eyes were on the amber side of hazel and big for my face, which I always played up when I wore makeup. By vampire standards, I looked like I tasted good, so what was with the hyper-focus on Beer Belly over there? Malachi Jameson entered the room and waved to me. This caused everyone to swivel their heads in my direction. Even the guy in the chair looked me over, eyes so full of malice that it made me shiver. "You're awake," Malachi said. I sat up and swung my feet to the ground. I wouldn't lounge like a Victorian hysteric. Not in front of him. I lifted my chin and forced my voice to sound strong. "Where am I?" "My office." "We're at my club." I rolled my eyes. Vamps and their clubs. Of course, Malachi Jameson owned a club. How else would he have even known of my father? But it wasn't my father's club. I could tell by the style of the office. I rubbed a hand over the velvet fabric of the chaise lounge. This place was understated and expensive. The club Dad had worked at wasn't this nice. The funeral home wanted to call an ambulance, but I talked them into letting me take you. He came to where I sat and offered me a hand up. "I have something to show you." I allowed him to pull me upright. "What is it?" "Justice." He took my elbow and guided me toward the man. The vamps parted before him, making way for us to pass. "Meet Larry Walker, the man who killed your father." My jaw dropped, and I staggered as my knees went numb. Old Beer Belly had killed my dad. Malachi steadied me, using a hand under each elbow. It took me several seconds to be able to speak. "Why?" "Walker comes from a long line of vampire hunters." Larry spat at Malachi. "Go to hell, Satan's spawn." Ah. And here we see a display of the ideology that drives him to murder innocent vampires. You see, Malachi drew me back as Larry worked on bringing up another loogie. He is of the misguided notion that vampires are evil and should be exterminated like vermin. Your father was an unfortunate target of his religious fervor. "I need to sit down," I said, my voice faint and my body weak. Gravity was trying to suck me down into a black vortex. If I wasn't careful, I would pass out again. When I stumbled, almost falling despite Malachi's support, he scooped me up in his arms and deposited me gently onto the chaise lounge. "Easy, child." Sorry," I stuttered. Everyone was staring at me, the girl too chicken shit to even stand in front of her father's murderer. I wanted to tell them I was brave. Hell, I wanted to show them I was, but the grief was too fresh and raw to allow me strength. I was sapped, drained as if a dozen vampires had sucked me dry. Malachi kneeled before me and took my chin in his hands. With careful gentleness, he removed my sunglasses. When I moved to stop him, he said, "Let me help you. I can make your burden lighter." Against my better judgment, I allowed him to proceed. There was a spark of kindness in his eyes that I found reassuring. Or perhaps I was just stupid with grief. Did it even matter if I was safe? I didn't have a reason to be careful. Not anymore. I bowed my head, studying the tasteful beige carpeting on the floor, unsure of what to do or where to look next. The floor couldn't mesmerize me, and thus was a safe focal point. I wondered why the decorator hadn't chosen red. I bet it was a bitch to clean blood out of such a light-colored rug. "Look at me, Miss Russell." Slowly, fearfully, I raised my head to meet his gaze. His eyes held a whole galaxy of stars. I lost myself in them, and a heaviness pressed down on me. Afraid, I made to twist my head away from him, but Malachi tightened his grip. "No harm will come to you, kin of our flesh." Had he said that aloud, or was he actually talking inside my head? I couldn't tell. "Take my strength," he said, his voice commanding. He lifted his arm to his mouth and bit down, and then pressed his wrist against my lips. I jerked back, but his hand whipped around my head and pressed me forward, pinning me in place, forcing his blood to seep past my tightly pressed lips. I whimpered like a lost kitten. Oh God. I was pathetic. "Drink, child. It will help." His voice was soothing, like a parent tending to a sick child. I closed my eyes and stopped fighting. His blood wasn't cold, but it also wasn't living warm either. But that didn't matter, because energy poured into me, unseen but very much felt. I drank then, drank deeply, and then it was over. I blinked to find Malachi standing in front of the vampire hunter. Somehow, I'd missed when he'd let go of my chin and left, but I did feel steadier. Not better, but more able to withstand the fact I was in a room with my father's killer, and a whole bunch of vampires I didn't know, while also slowly dying myself. Malachi crossed his arms and regarded his prisoner. "Larry Walker, you have killed one of our clan, and as such you will forfeit your life. Go ahead, kill me." A snarl twisted Larry's lips. "You're just proving what a soul-sucking lowlife you are." Malachi leaned down, a hand on either side of the chair, his face inches from Larry's. "Oh, we're not going to kill you, Mr. Walker. We don't believe in that. I think you may be misinformed." His voice was as smooth as silk, yet promised only blood and pain. Goosebumps clutched at my spine. Malachi had a dark side. I made a mental note to remember that. A tight smile flashed across Malachi's lips, and he stared into Larry's eyes. "What did they tell you?" "That we would cut out your heart and drink the blood inside." Larry grimaced and squeezed his eyes shut. Malachi gave a small shake of his head. "They lied, Mr. Walker. Our justice doesn't include murder. In fact, quite the opposite." Malachi straightened and stepped away. "You will spend your life in our service. Nurturing us, protecting us, doing our bidding." "No." Larry strained against his bonds, thrashing in his chair until it rocked backward. Two vampires rushed forward to catch him, righting the chair and anchoring Larry down. Malachi continued, unaffected by Larry's outburst. "Your heart will beat for us, Mr. Walker. You will forget your Jesus, your Satan, your politics. They don't matter when you have an eternity to live." Larry started to recite the Lord's Prayer. A few of the vampires joined in, snickering at the look of horror on the vampire hunter's face as he heard their voices alongside his. "It's not that we don't believe in Jesus," said a vampire with long blonde hair and a leather bustier that threatened to push her girls up to her ears. "It's that we don't need him anymore. When you have eternity, you only need yourself," said a male vamp in a black t-shirt emblazoned with a sugar skull. His black jeans hung low on his hips, right on the edge of revealing his underwear. "Unless you meet up with a vampire hunter, I said, my voice louder and stronger than I'd expected. Eternity only takes you so far. Just ask my dad. The vampires shifted uncomfortably at that. They might like to think they were untouchable, but that wasn't a lie I couldn't allow them to believe. Not with me in the room. Picking up steam, I walked over to Larry. The man you killed was more than a vampire. He was my dad. My dad took care of me. My dad loved me, and you took the only parent I had left. You're lucky the vampires found you before I did, because I would kill you. Happily. Drawing back my hand, I slapped Larry across the face. The hit stung my palm, but didn't even rock the vampire hunter. I smacked him again, putting all my strength into it, and then I kicked him in the stomach, pushing in with the spike of my high heel. Larry grunted as I drove my foot home. The vamps holding his chair cast concerned looks toward Malachi, who motioned for them to move back. They dragged Larry away from me, but I followed, itching to kick him with my other foot. Malachi caught my arm, tugging me back. Easy. I bristled against his grip. Why did you bring me here? To make you an offer. I had thought to do this tomorrow, to give you some time, but things are moving faster than I anticipated. I searched his gaze, momentarily unafraid of being mesmerized. What kind of offer? Malachi nodded to the vampires, who quickly filed out the office door, until it was just the three of us. Me, Larry, and Malachi. I was not completely unaware of your situation. He escorted me back to the chaise. Perching on the edge of the large wooden desk in the room, he clasped his hands together. You see, your father spoke to me about you. My eyes widened. He did. Yes. Turning someone involves he paused, casting about for the right word. After a moment, he settled on, an intimate relationship. I blanched. You mean sex? He cocked his head to the side and studied me, as if taken aback by the bluntness of my words. Yes. And your father wasn't comfortable with that aspect of turning you. I blinked rapidly, as if clearing my vision would do the same for my head. My father was attacked. He didn't have sex and he was turned. Malachi gave me a sympathetic smile. I think perhaps your father edited the story of his turning to suit your sensibilities. I refused to accept what Malachi was saying. But he didn't want to be a vampire. Malachi lifted his shoulders in a noncommittal shrug. Maybe so, but either way, sex was part of bringing him over. I grimaced. The last thing I wanted to do was talk about my dead dad's sex life. Tell me about this offer. I crossed my arms and pinned Malachi with a stern look. Yes, of course. He cleared his throat. I will turn you, and you will join my clan. My father asked you to do this, didn't he? That's why he spoke to you. I squirmed in my chair, uncomfortable and feeling violated. The idea of my father having that kind of discussion with any man wasn't something I liked knowing. It was worse than discussing his sex life. Malachi nodded. Although with his death, I also feel some responsibility for you. But why you? I looked around, noting again the tasteful decor. Dad's club had specialized in pin-up girls and a 50s diner feel. Apparently, the owner had been turned at the height of the doo-wop era. What I'd seen so far of Malachi's club was very old world and gothic with rich colors and textures. He didn't work here. Why would he come to you? Because I am the master of this district. No one is turned without my approval. Your father came to me just a few days before he was. Malachi trailed off, not wanting to say the words. Fang whore. Larry's voice lashed at me. Your daddy was a depraved blood-sucker just like all the rest. I ignored him and focused on Malachi. Is there some reason why you're letting my father's murderer listen to this conversation? I'm no murderer. You can't kill something that's already dead. Larry gave a derisive snort. We both pretended not to hear him, although I did find myself tempted to go and smash my foot into his stomach some more. Larry isn't a threat now. It doesn't matter what he hears, Malachi said. I want to give you first bite. I raised my eyebrows. First bite? What's that? It is our tradition to let each clan member take a vassal's blood. That way, they will never be free of us. But I'm not a vampire. I looked at Larry, unable to identify any redeeming qualities. Why not kill him? 1. You're not a vampire yet. 2. Killing just fuels more hate. It's better to preserve the life of someone like Larry Walker. Let his family see he's untouched. Perhaps even send him to spy on his cronies, and thus save the lives of our kind. Even more importantly, humans are our food supply. If we killed everyone who crossed us, we would starve. The planet has almost 8 billion people. I don't think running out is a problem. Malachi frowned. It's not the one person we kill. It's the hundreds and thousands who rise up against us as a result of that one death who are a problem. Plus, we can't feed on everyone. Case in point, you. I put a hand to my chest. Why not? What's wrong with me? Vampires don't feed on the diseased. I stiffened at the word diseased. It made me sound like I was a plague victim, and Malachi said the word without any concern over how I might feel about the label. But you're offering to turn me. Am I understanding this right? Correct. He gave a curt nod. Feeding isn't the same as turning. You can still be turned. Turned. The idea made my heart race like it wanted to run away. Malachi could save me. Or damn me. With vampires, you never knew. Dad and I had talked about this. About making me a vampire. But I'd hoped I had time. Hoped maybe there'd be a cure. I just don't have to worry about anyone munching on my neck for a quick snack. He nodded again. We require healthy blood for nourishment. So I taste bad? Larry with his big hairy gut surely couldn't taste better than me. I was still in my 20s, for goodness sakes. Malachi pursed his lips and simply watched me for a moment. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he said, No, I don't think so. It's been a long time since I last fed on someone like you, and I don't recall it being unpleasant. Who was that? I asked, curious. My wife? He bowed his head. She. He paused, and his expression crumbled, revealing a deep sadness, before snapping back into the smooth facade he'd worn all night. She didn't make it. We waited too long. I'm sorry. I lifted my hand, wanting to lean forward and touch him, wanting to offer him what sympathy I could, but I hesitated, eventually letting my hand drop to my side. We didn't know each other well enough for that. If he'd been human, I would have folded him into a warm hug, but Malachi was a vampire. No matter how much sorrow I saw in his eyes, or how handsome he was, I couldn't forget that. It was a long time ago. Aye, he paused and looked over my head, his gaze fixed. I don't talk about her much. He sighed, and once again seemed to fight to compose himself. When his face was an expressionless mask once again, he said, I try to look forward, not back. I would suggest you do the same, Miss Russell. Call me Dawn. Stiff formalities didn't fit with all the secrets we were telling. He knew so much about me, and had shared something about himself in turn. In a sense, we were even. Surely that must put us on a first-name basis. He tipped his head in acknowledgement of my request. Dawn it is. Okay. You have Larry. You know about me. What's next, Malachi? His name rolled off my tongue, and I shivered at the taste of it. It wasn't just that Malachi was handsome. He had a palpable energy that made me feel connected to him somehow. Perhaps it had been a mistake to drink his blood. If you agree to my offer, we will hold Mr. Walker until you are turned. He will be your first feed. Malachi shot a wicked smile toward Larry. I raised my hands, palms up. I don't really have a choice. It's either this or I die. He narrowed his eyes. There's no medicine you could take? If you need money, I would be happy to help. I shook my head. The cancer is the same type as my mom's, which means it's resistant to everything they've got. It's in the early stages still, but I have a year at most. I'd read all the studies and puzzled out the biochemistry on my own. There was no hope. Not unless science moved forward. He folded his hands in his lap and contemplated them, his lips pursed. What do you want from life? I took in a deep breath and let it out slowly. What kind of answer do you want? My heart's desire, which is probably impossible, or the practical answer? Both, he said, flashing a smile. I want to cure cancer. I've been studying it since my mom died. His eyebrows shot up. You have? I leaned forward, excited to share. I'm good at math and science. Really good. And I've studied the biochemistry up and down, and inside and out. I know cancer and I have lots of ideas. I just need the credentials and experience to figure out if any of my theories are any good. That's your heart's desire. I nodded. Yeah. The practical path was simply medical research. I shrugged and looked away, finding eye contact too intense just then. It doesn't matter anymore, though. Yes, it does, Malachi said with a ferocity that surprised me. He put a finger under my chin and forced me to lift my head and look at him. How old were you when your mom passed? 15. I pushed his hand away. Amazing. He shook his head. And you took it upon yourself to do all that research as a child. I waved off his praise. Don't be impressed. I didn't save her. She died anyway. I swallowed back tears. I needed more time. Time is precisely what I can give you. All the time in the world to do your work. Malachi gave a broad smile, and something I took as excitement shined in his eyes. Don't do it, girl. Go to glory. Jesus himself will meet you at the gates, Larry said. I stood and faced the vampire hunter. If you think I'm going to die without making you pay for what you did to my dad, you're crazy. Here's a news flash, Larry Walker. If you're the kind of person who gets to heaven, I want to go to hell. You'll burn. He spat the words at me. Burn in torment while Satan shreds your soul with his claws. And so will you. I'll make sure of it. Turning back to Malachi, I said, I accept your offer. Turn me, I'm yours. Chapter 3. First, a kiss. He stood, and before I could say anything, he took my hand and pulled me out of his office and into an adjacent room, this one smaller with only a few stray chairs scattered about in a haphazard fashion. There he stepped close to me, crowding me with his height and the burning intensity of his gaze. A kiss, I echoed, my voice tentative. His hand went to the side of my head, cradling my cheek. We should know if we are compatible. And if we aren't, I watched, transfixed as his head dipped down, mouth inching closer to mine. There are others who might suit you better. He pulled me forward and our lips met. I stopped breathing, hyper-aware of his touch and how my very life rested in his hands. Malachi, I whispered against his lips. Shh, child. Let me taste you. His tongue slipped into my mouth, igniting a fire deep in my belly with rapid strokes. I sagged against Malachi as all the blood in my body pooled in my core, stealing strength from my limbs. His sturdy chest caught me, and his arms tensed as they took my weight. He sucked my bottom lip into his mouth, drawing it out and nibbling on the tender flesh. Sharpness pricked me, and I tasted blood. He'd broken my skin with his fangs. I moaned in protest and tried to push myself away, but he shushed me. Drawing his head back, he said, "Let me have this little bit of you." "Why?" I asked, breathless. He'd stirred a dark desire in me, and it was hungry, but also wary. "I would know the blood that will become part of my clan." His gaze probed mine, dark as eclipse extinguishing the sun. "It is a serious matter to turn a human. Do you understand that?" I shrugged. The vampire who turned my father didn't seem to take it too seriously. He gave a small nod, acknowledging my point. "True, but I am nothing like the woman who brought your father over. I take my responsibilities as master seriously. I must think of you and the rest of my clan as well as my enemies." Malachi paused for a second, watching me with such steadiness. I wondered if he might be a statue. He didn't breathe or move. If not for our kiss, I would have thought he wasn't real. Finally, he said, "You're a risk, Dawn. You haven't been selected out of a pool of council-approved candidates. I must make sure you will be worth the complaints I will endure." I ducked my head. "Look, I know I'm not the prettiest girl." "You're also dying," he interrupted. "One of our most sacred laws is we don't bring over the dead or dying." I met his eyes then. "Why would you break the law for me?" He smiled, but the gesture was sad, accompanied with a heavy darkness in his eyes. "Because of my family. You see, it wasn't just my wife I lost, but my daughter too." A small tear slipped down his cheek, and I caught it, amazed by the pink hue. I showed him my finger, and he surprised me by leaning down to delicately lick the tear off my finger, the soft flick of his tongue raising a shiver up my spine. "Jessica was smart and spirited, much like you. She liked to watch the stars and chart their courses. She wasn't afraid of anything." He pulled open my jacket and pointed to the stakes I'd hidden inside. "She would have done the same as you. But she became ill and ran out of time. There are too many who will never have enough time." We were both silent for a beat, absorbing the truth of his words. "Did you try to turn her?" I held my breath, hoping for some reassurance that what I was doing was right. He swallowed hard. "I wanted to, but like your father, I could not violate my own child." "What did you do?" "I found someone who agreed to turn her, but he was a shyster." Malachi's face darkened. "He swindled me out of my money and botched the turn. You see, he didn't really know what he was doing. His master had disavowed him before he'd learned the correct technique. I did not know this at the time. I was still quite new myself." I put a hand to my chest, trying to keep my heart from sinking. "And your daughter? Did she turn?" "She rose, but as a shuffling, mindless thing. A zombie, if you will." He pressed his lips together until they became thin, narrow lines. Then, with a little shake of his shoulders, he said, "I had to decapitate her, sever her limbs, and bury her in pieces. For all I know," his voice caught, "she's still moving underground, even after all these years. I'm so sorry." I laid a hand on his shoulder. "It was a long time ago." He blinked rapidly, fighting more tears. "But you can understand where my sympathy comes from. I know what it is to be a father and a vampire. I could not save your father or my wife or my daughter, but I think I can help you. I try to save who I can." "Thank you." I leaned into his embrace and pressed my lips against his. Malachi wrapped his arms around me, but broke our kiss. He looked down at me, his gaze serious. "You must understand. There is a risk that you will suffer a similar fate as my daughter or my wife. You might not make it." My eyes widened, and sudden fear skittered through me, making my heart clench. "But I thought you knew how to do it." "I do, But the law against raising the dead and dying is because they often don't cross over well. He cupped my face in his hands. I could do everything perfectly, and you still might not survive. The night you turn may be your last night on this earth. I trembled at his words, picturing myself buried like his daughter, body parts scattered in a dozen different directions, twitching and convulsing for an eternity. If you have any doubts, this is the time to say no. I won't stop once we start. He put a hand on each shoulder and stared deep into my eyes. There's no going back, Dawn. All right, I said after a moment. I understand. Are you sure? Stop asking me that. What choice do I have? Tears burned my eyes. Cancer is eating me like candy. I saw how it killed my mom. I don't want that. Maybe I can't live a normal life, but I still want to live. I'm not ready to die. I have work to do. I straightened to my full height, resolute. He simply held me close for a moment after that, swaying a little as if rocking a baby. And just that one small kindness undid me. Tears streamed down my face, and sobs choked my throat. Shush. Don't cry, child. It will be okay. This life is born of darkness, but it also brings hope and even joy. You will see. Thank you, I sobbed against his chest. He kissed my forehead. It's late, and the sun will rise soon. Go prepare yourself, Dawn. Be ready for me. I will make you mine tomorrow night. Chapter 4. I spent the day outside, enjoying the last sunlight I would see for eternity. I went to a park, and settling on a bench, I lifted my face to the sky, relishing the warmth. This would never be part of my life again. Tonight, I would die and rise as a vampire. I didn't know if I was happy or sad. Maybe just relieved. I didn't want to die, but this was my only way to have any semblance of a life. It helped that Malachi didn't repulse me. He was handsome and considerate in a way I hadn't expected vampires to be. My father had been bitter about his change. No one had offered to turn him. He hadn't consented. Vampires had just ripped his life away. Malachi could think otherwise, but I knew Dad wouldn't lie about how he was turned. Dad made the best of his situation, but at times, he spoke disparagingly of vampires. Given a choice, he would never want me to turn, but cancer was just as bad as the vamp who'd attacked him. It had taken away my choices too. Malachi was my future. My humanity had nothing left living for. An hour after dusk, a black car with tinted windows pulled into the driveway of my house. Malachi stepped out and walked up to my front door, rapping it with his knuckles as I watched from the living room window. I checked the mirror in the foyer one last time. I didn't quite know what to wear to die, but I'd done my best. My dress was deep blue with a flared skirt, and I'd done my best to make a messy bun with my hair. As for makeup, I'd kept things understated. For shoes, I'd opted for ballet flats. High heels were too much to manage on top of everything else. Malachi knocked again, and I flew to answer the door, my heart fluttering in my chest. Good evening, Dawn. He gave a little bow, looking handsome in black pants and a button-down dress shirt that had been left open at his throat. His dark hair was tousled and effortlessly debonair. The vampire standing before me was one hell of an attractive man. Hello, Malachi. You look lovely. His gaze traveled the sweetheart neckline of my dress, lingering on my cleavage. Heat burned my cheeks, and I resisted the urge to cross my arms over my breasts. Thanks. He offered me his elbow. Shall we? I hesitated. Where are we going? To my house. It will give us the privacy we need. I slipped my hand into the crook of his arm and glanced over my shoulder at the empty house behind me. Dad had always interrogated my dates. I missed him. I'd lost the people who guarded my back. It was up to me to watch out for myself. Malachi led me to his car and held the door open, shutting it firmly once I was safe inside. I studied him as he walked around to the driver's side, wondering if I could trust him. Then I shook my head, scattering those thoughts. It was pointless to second-guess myself at this point. No one else was lining up offering to fix my troubles. I would just have to hope that there was more life in death. Malachi's house turned out to be an enormous Victorian mansion, set in a field an hour's drive outside of town. I'd grown up in the suburbs, with homes crowded together like they were afraid to be alone. With its grand double front doors, a turret tall enough for Rapunzel, and impeccable landscaping bursting with flowers and foliage, the home had a dreamlike fairy tale quality. Also, it was probably worth 10 times what my childhood home cost. He guided me inside, and I couldn't hold back a soft gasp at the interior of the house. From where I stood, I could see the living room and dining room, as well as glimpses of rooms further in. The house had been maintained like a museum, while also being modernized. The wood floors and door frames were original, but the walls were painted with modern neutral tones: creams, beiges, and light green. The furniture was also up to date. None of that uncomfortable antique stuff that used to fill my grandmother's house and make my back ache. Soft Persian rugs took up the center of each room, bordered by the rich, walnut tone of the floor. Sleek electronics filled the living room, a flat screen mounted over the fireplace with surround sound speakers, along with an elaborate music system that included a record player. The dining room held a long wooden table and ornately carved chairs. A china cabinet glittered with cut crystal. In front of me, a staircase wound its way up to the next floor, and if I leaned a little toward the dining room, I could see down the hallway that led to the kitchen. Artwork hung on the walls. Food still lifes in the dining room and hunting scenes in the living room. A large floral piece graced the entryway in a swirl of rose and green. From the rugged texture of the paint, they all appeared to be original works. "Sit." Malachi gestured toward the living room. "I'll pour some wine." He ushered me to a couch. I sat and studied the staircase, thinking of the bedrooms it led to, one of which I would spend the night in. Malachi fiddled with the sound system until soothing piano music filled the air. Then he disappeared for a moment, I assumed into the kitchen, and returned with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He opened the wine and poured it, handing a glass to me. I took a tentative sip, and then made an appreciate sound. "Nice." Malachi tasted it for himself and nodded. "Yes, sweet and full-bodied." His eyes locked with mine. "It reminds me of you." I blushed and bowed my head, unable to face him. He sat with me on the love seat, running a finger along my cheek. "Are you always so afraid of compliments?" I moved my head away from his touch, too nervous to be that close to him. "We're not here because of mutual attraction." "Are you sure?" He set his wine glass down and scooted closer to me, pinning me down. Leaning in close to my ear, he whispered, "I seem to recall enjoying our kiss immensely. A sentiment you appeared to share, or was I wrong?" I closed my eyes, shuddering slightly as his deep voice quivered in my ears. "It was a nice kiss." "Nice." He made a scoffing sound as he relieved me of my wine glass. "I think perhaps a reminder is in order." He turned me toward him with insistent hands, and before I could protest, his mouth covered mine for a second kiss. He'd been gentle with me before, keeping himself in check, but this time around, his lips were wild things that tore moans from the back of my throat. His tongue stroked mine, up and down, over and around. Then he bit my bottom lip, pricking it with his fangs once again. I expected the blood, but the wet heat that seeped between my legs surprised me. Pulling away, he said, "If that is merely nice, I fear you will never be satisfied." Fingering my bottom lip, which was swollen and throbbing in time with my heartbeat, I suppressed a shudder of desire. A matching pulse quivered in my core. No, you're right. Nice isn't the right word. He leaned in again, and between kisses said, sultry. Scorching. A brand upon your soul. Those describe our kiss much better. He swept me into his arms again. Now let's kiss you someplace else and see how that feels. With that, he stood and carried me up the stairs. I clutched at his shoulders, terrified and utterly enthralled at the same time. Chapter 5. Malachi's bedroom was a mix of burgundy and black. Thick brocade curtains in burgundy covered the windows, and dim lights on the walls barely beat back the dark of night. A large bed covered with a black duvet took up the center of the room. Malachi fell back on the mattress, still cradling me in his arms. His mouth sought out mine again, while his hands pulled at my clothes. I tried not to think, to just feel and give myself to him, but I stiffened when he pulled down the zipper on my dress. Trust me, Dawn. I do not do this lightly. His hand slipped inside my dress, caressing the skin along my spine. I arched into his hand as his fingers plucked my nerves, playing me like an instrument, one he knew well. I do trust you, Malachi, but that doesn't make this easy. No, it's not easy, he said, his voice somber. But I can make it feel so good, you won't care anymore. Just let me in. His eyes met mine. The swirling darkness of his gaze wrapped around me like soft velvet and made the world spin. I held onto him tighter. My breath caught in my throat, like someone had sucker punched me. I was going to be sick. I struggled to break away from Malachi so I didn't throw up all over him, but he wouldn't let me go. Bringing his face close, his nose bumping mine, he whispered, "Look deeper." His words hit me as hard as the thump of a bass drum at a rock concert. They echoed through me, distorted but still loud enough to make my ears ring. His gaze bore down on me, and I whimpered at its weight. My stomach didn't bother me anymore. All that mattered was the midnight gleam of his eyes. And now you are mine. All mine. His hands stroked up and down my spine, and then pulled my dress forward, down my arms. Stand up. I stumbled to do as he asked, my legs moving before I'd even processed his request. As I did so, it only seemed natural to kick off my dress, as it had fallen around my ankles. All that remained was my underwear, a modest bikini brief, and soft cut bra with a lace overlay. Malachi stood and walked around me, hands briefly grazing my skin here and there as he went. I didn't expect white lace. He touched my ass. Or so much fabric here. One of the things I like most about modern life is the laundry. He strode across the room and threw open the closet door there. After a moment of rummaging around, he returned with a triumphant smile. I ordered a few things for you just in case. I think these will suit you better. He waved whatever was in his hand at me before stepping behind to release the clasp of my bra. I caught the fabric as it went slack around my breasts. My underwear, he tore away with a swift, hard yank. Kneeling down, he held up a pair of what turned out to be black lace panties. I lifted each foot in turn, and he inched the fabric up my legs, the lace bunching up and frictioning against my skin. He smoothed it out and fussed with it until he was satisfied. Spread your legs. Again, my body obeyed, before my brain had even processed what he'd said. I opened for him, unable to deny the power of his voice. Dipping a finger in the heat between my thighs, he said, "These adorn but do not obstruct." "You always keep a supply of crotchless panties on hand?" I asked, grinding slightly into his hand. "I find they are the only panties worth wearing," he said with a wicked smile. "Otherwise, nights like this aren't as much fun." Remaining on his knees, he centered himself at the juncture of my thighs. He licked his lips, his eyes bright with a predatory gleam that would have frightened me if not for the fact that I was mesmerized. Lowering his head, he buried his face in my mound. His lips burned my skin, and his tongue thrust into my flesh, shoving it aside until he found the sensitive pearl buried there. I sucked in air, wondering if I would fall. Despite my ballet flats, I struggled to keep my balance. Malachi dug his fingers into my hip, steadying me and adding a new layer of sensation. He stopped then and pulled away. Silent and with fluid grace, he rolled to his feet, his height towering over me once again. Tugging at my bra, he said, "Let's change into something more suitable for tonight." I let the bra go without resistance and slipped my arms into the strap of the black lace confection he offered to me. Like the panties, the new bra was not designed for day-to-day use, but rather for the privacy of the bedroom. It lifted my breasts, mounding them up, but it did not cover anything, leaving my nipples exposed and tightening in the open air. Malachi fastened the black lace bra around my back and then took a moment to admire the view. Stunning. He ran a lone finger down my shoulder. "Come sit on the bed." He held my elbow as I moved. Excellent. His hands went to my knees and wrenched them apart. Stay just like that. He lowered himself, pausing on his way down to kiss me again, fangs pricking my lower lip to suck more blood. He hovered over my breasts, his breath fanning the tightness of my nipples. Pressing his lips at the top of each areola, he continued down until he knelt once more between my legs. He inhaled deeply several times. "You smell like the sun. So warm." He thrust a finger into me without preamble. "And wet. Rich with life. I will drink you down and do it gladly." Dipping his head, his mouth sought out my core, tongue stroking up and down my nether lips. Another finger joined the first inside me, pressing into my moist darkness. With a wiggle of his tongue, he found my clit and worked it with quick little flicks, teasing touches that rushed me to an orgasmic precipice, but refused to push me over. I threw my head back, my hips arching toward Malachi in a desperate mission to grind against his tongue. Something sharp bit into me, and I shuddered as pain pierced my core. What are you doing?" It stung now, and edged out the pleasure, clearing my head. Malachi drew back and met my eyes. "Tasting you." He licked his lips, and I saw the stain of blood on one fang. "You're feeding from me." "Down there." I snapped my knees shut, but he was faster than me and inserted his hand between them, keeping me from closing myself off completely. "I will feed from your whole body, Dawn. This is the way of vampires. This is how you turn." He pushed against my knees, forcing them to open. His eyes locked with mine. "You fight me, but you don't really mean it, do you? You want this, remember? Open for me, give yourself to me. Let me consume you." My body went slack. He didn't have to push against my knees anymore, they just fell to the side. That was the power of his eyes. They took me over, made his desires mine, until I lost myself to them. He owned me. I was his. For a brief moment, I considered that this was Larry's future. He would forever be enthralled, owned by the vampires he hated. Good. He didn't deserve a future, but me. I did. Even if it meant I had to die first. At least this was going to feel good. I doubted Larry would enjoy his enthrallment. In fact, I would make it a personal mission to ensure my fangs breaking his skin hurt as much as possible. Then Malachi's tongue found my clit again and halted my brain in its tracks. He sucked hard at my core, pulling my flesh into his mouth, rolling it between his teeth and nipping at it delicately. Where his teeth pierced the skin, his tongue rushed after to soothe the wound, covering any sting with long, smooth strokes. Pleasure smoldered deep in my belly, my inner thighs quivered as Malachi took over my body. With several hard sucks alternated with rough lashings of his tongue, he took me past the brink. I cried out and fell back on the bed, too overcome to stay upright. Malachi stepped away then to shed his clothes, and then climbed up my body, hovering over me, his eyes full of dark promises, my blood wet on his lips. He kissed me, and I tasted all of it. The salt, the metallic tang of my blood all mixed with the juices of my orgasm. His mouth swallowed mine in a punishing kiss that left my lips swollen. I ran my hands over his shoulders, relishing his lean body rippling with sleek muscle. Malachi broke our kiss and slipped down to nuzzle my breasts. My nipples were already stiff with desire, but he pulled on the aching points with his lips, demanding more. I arched up, clutching his head against my chest, trying to ease the tension, but he pushed me down on the bed, hands pinning me at my shoulders. I whimpered, and he smiled. I won't go easy on you. What happens tonight isn't for the weak. Show me how strong you are, Dawn. I let my hands drop and went still, transfixed as his mouth covered one breast again. His tongue whipped the tender tip, and then he sucked, pulling my nipple up into his mouth, stretching me on the edge of pain and pleasure, until I thought I might snap. I moaned, and then shrieked as his fangs bit into me. Wetness flooded my core, done with the first orgasm and ready for the second. He switched breasts, giving me a matching set of fang marks over each nipple. The blood oozed out of the first bite, and I caught it on my finger, studying it in the dim light. Malachi took my hand in his and delicately licked the blood off. Bleeding is how you know you're alive. Or dying, I added. Touché. He straddled my hips, his cock large and hard. Are you ready, Dawn? To die? I asked, my heart quickening. No, to live, he corrected, and then he was inside me, filling my core with one hard thrust. This part will be fast. Don't fight me or it can disrupt the turn. Will it hurt? I tried to imagine the sting of his fangs on a larger scale. Malachi shook his head. No, not like you think. This isn't murder. Then do it. I grabbed his hips and urged him forward. He obliged by pressing into me, going deeper than before. It wasn't enough. I needed more. I raised my legs, and he shouldered them, lifting me up. Malachi moved faster, slamming me with his weight, sinking into my wet heat until I was breathless. The next orgasm arrived within seconds, and that was the moment when Malachi bent down, bringing his mouth to my neck and my legs to my ears, crushing the air out of my lungs. I didn't care. Pleasure seared me, overriding all sensation. I knew Malachi had bitten me, but I couldn't feel anything but the orgasm. I was caught in a river of sensation, water spilling over the banks, flooding me until I gave up on breathing. The river slowed, but just for a moment, after which another orgasm exploded, submerging me into its whirling rapids. The soft candlelight was gone now. All I could see was the darkness as the current swept me under for the last time. Chapter 6. Dawn? Came the hiss of a voice, more air than sound. I stirred, ears straining. Pain lanced my bones, threatening to crack them like ripe nuts. My muscles had become as stiff and brittle as concrete. I was cold too, a burning chill that hit me like an iceberg. I tried to cry, but there were no tears. Everything was frozen. Here, drink this. It will warm you. The voice was louder now, a deep tenor I recognized as Malachi. Something wet trickled into my mouth, but I couldn't swallow. I could taste it, though. It was blood, slightly warm and heavy with iron. Malachi put a hand under my neck and tilted my head back. The blood ran in a tiny stream down my throat. More followed, and the impenetrable stiffness of my body eased enough that I could swallow. It tasted good, so good. Like life, but more than that. I caught the flavor of the beautiful soul behind it too. I was drinking an angel, the absolute divinity of life. After swallowing, came blinking, followed by the ability to move my hands, and then arms. My legs and torso thawed last. As soon as I could, I gripped Malachi's wrist, which turned out to be the source of the blood, and sucked with a wild fervor. I was so hungry, I feared nothing would ever fill me up. But Malachi pulled away. I groaned in protest, hands reaching, fighting to hold him in place, but I was too weak still, and he easily resisted me. "There's more than my blood to drink tonight," he said in a soothing tone that seemed to stroke up and down my spine. I sighed and relaxed. The vampire hunter awaited. I licked my lips. Revenge would taste so good. Did pain flavor blood? I would delight in testing the theory on Larry. Malachi offered me a hand, and I took it, allowing him to pull me upright. He dropped my dress over my head. "What about my underwear?" I asked, feeling immodest in my crotchless panties and bra that covered nothing. "What about it?" Malachi arched an eyebrow, his eyes glittering. "What's the fun in virginal white? You're turned now, and more importantly," he wrapped his arms around me and pulled the zipper of my dress up in one swift motion, "you're mine. Call me a demanding lover, but I want you the way I want you. And right now, that means naked and ready for me under this dress." He nuzzled my neck, lips pressing with gentle pressure against the spot where he'd bitten me. "Well, when you put it like that, who am I to say no?" My voice was faint with the strain of my turn as well as newly stirred desire. Larry cried when he saw me. Big fat tears that ran down his cheeks. He pleaded for mercy, stuttering out various Bible verses. But I wasn't evil. God didn't need to smite me. After all, I wasn't a murderer. I was me. A new version of myself that wouldn't die of cancer. A me that could devote the full ability of my brain to finding a cure. A me that could mete out eternal justice to the damned among the living. I would save lives, not take them, and Larry would spend what remained of his time on this earth, serving my higher calling. It was a sign of how small his mind was that he couldn't see his destiny the way I did. I'd wanted to hurt him earlier, to make him pay, but now regretted those emotions. Hate begat hate. I refused to feed it. We would help so many people. He would see that soon enough, and maybe then he could let go of the burden of his hate. So I kissed Larry on the cheek, and then gazed deep into his eyes, murmuring soothing words of comfort. Mesmerizing came naturally to me, and before long, he'd relaxed, his beer belly moving with gentle breaths. "He's ready," Malachi said, putting a hand on my shoulder. I blinked, so caught up in Larry's watery blue eyes that I'd forgotten the next step. I nodded, and lifted the man's wrist to my mouth. My gaze locked with his. I bit him. Warm blood filled my mouth, vibrant and gushing with life. As it turned out, bald men with beer bellies didn't taste half bad. Peace fell over me, and the knot of grief lodged in my heart relaxed and melted away. Dad was gone, and I would miss him, as well as Mom. But now I had hope, instead of black despair. This was just the beginning. Malachi pulled me away. "Not too much, child. Leave some for the others." "Sorry," I said, slurring through my fangs. My head whirled as Larry's blood hit my system. I decided I must be blood drunk. Surely that was a thing, right? Malachi took a moment to sip from Larry's wrist, and then whisked me away to his car. I relaxed in my seat, gazing with rapt attention out the window. I could see everything in the dark. The world no longer held any shadows. Back at his house, we sat together on the porch and watched the stars. With my vampire-enhanced vision, they shined brighter than ever. I leaned against Malachi, relishing the feel of his strength. "You did well, Dawn." Malachi took my hand and lifted it to his mouth, raining a series of kisses on my palm that fluttered over my skin like butterfly wings. I looked down at myself. My body and brain appeared to be in working order. Other than the sharp fangs in my mouth, I hadn't changed at all. Did I cross over all right? I asked. I felt okay, but I wanted the reassurance that there was no hidden defect. I shuddered, remembering his daughter and the botched attempt to turn her. Yes. He squeezed my hand. You turned beautifully. You're free now. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this short story. Readers often contact me asking for more from Dawn, but this is all she wanted to share so far. However, I do have more vampire books. Check out my best-selling and very steamy Blood Courtesan series, which are full-length novels and currently available in ebook format with audiobooks coming soon. In a world where vampires are real, blood is a financial asset, and sex mixed with blood commands the highest price. About the author. USA Today and NY Times bestselling author Michelle Fox lives in the Midwest with her husband, Teen, the occasional exchange student, and 2 labs who steal her socks and all the space on the couch. She loves fantasy and romance, which makes writing paranormal romance and urban fantasy a natural fit. In her spare time, she helps remodel her 1860s farmhouse and tries not to murder the garden. Her primary function, however, is to serve as the wheels and wallet for her teen. She loves chocolate, drinks a lot of tea, and still believes in magic. Sound recording copyright 2023 and produced by Deep Zen Limited 2023.
Be sure to subscribe for more free audiobooks. Thank you for listening.